Eva Bellin is the Myra and Robert Kraft Professor of Arab Politics at Brandeis. She's written a book called Stalled Democracy, Capital, Labor, and the Paradox of State-Sponsored Development, and a lot of other work on the relationship of development and democracy, particularly in the Middle East.
I am going to discuss democratizing development, but talk about it from the perspective of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, of course, the biggest news from that part of the world with regard to this question is that for the first time in the longest time, we can really talk about a process of political democratization in the region. Because thanks to this astonishing mobilization of popular protest across the Arab world that we have seen over the last 12 months, this region, which had long been stuck in this quagmire of authoritarianism, has begun to shake off that legacy. Over the past 12 months, we've seen 4 countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, jettison their authoritarian leaders. And we've seen 2 other countries, Jordan and Morocco, undertake politically liberalizing reforms. And the pressure for political reform is growing in other countries in the region as well. So the question is, what impact will this tentative progress toward political opening and toward political inclusion, what impact is that going to have on the question of economic inclusion and social equity? And that's what I'm going to focus on for the next 15 minutes. Now, I'm going to give you the takeaway up front. So here is what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that political and economic inclusion are less closely paired than we might hope, that democratic reform may spell popular empowerment in political terms, and that's something that should be valued in its own right, but it's likely to have very mixed results in terms of bettering the distribution of economic benefits in society. And most importantly, political inclusion is likely to have mixed impact in terms of delivering growth. And so it's likely to have mixed impact on the most pressing development challenge in the region, which is unemployment. So that's what I'm going to argue. So how do I get to this analysis? Let's start by considering the relationship between political inclusion and economic inclusion, and whether there's any intrinsic analytic connection between the two. Now, idealists who are committed to both political inclusion and economic equity have long been susceptible to the persuasion that all good things go together. They've long been inclined to believe that the extension of political rights to an ever larger portion of society will result in the fairer sharing of society's bounty. And conversely, that political exclusion of major segments of society will spell economic exclusion as well. Now, there are valid grounds for this analytic pairing, but the reality is often quite different. And we only need to look at the United States to know that this is true. In terms of formal political institutions, the United States is one of the most politically inclusive democracies in the world. And yet the US ranks as one of the least economically inclusive countries among its industrialized peers. So if you look at US performance on social indicators such as infant mortality or economic inequality, you will find us placed in the company of countries that are much poorer and much less democratic than we are. So clearly, provision of formally equal opportunities for political inclusion do not guarantee commensurate access to society's wealth. Now, the fact that political and economic inclusion are not a matched pair is nowhere more evident than in the Arab world. This is a region that has been long renowned for authoritarianism. It's long been ranked as the most authoritarian region in the world if you look at all the measurements by reputable institutions like Freedom House and Polity. And yet, the region's performance in terms of economic inclusion, in terms of sharing the wealth among most segments of society, has been surprisingly strong. And this is evident in terms of a number of social indicators. So, for example, the Arab world's performance is most impressive in terms of limiting absolute levels of absolute poverty. The Arab world has long had the lowest level of absolute poverty of all developing regions in the world. That is, a smaller percentage of people live on $1 or $2 a day in the Arab world than is true in Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or East Asia. In this regard, the Arab world is comparable to the super successful countries, the most successful countries of East and Southeast Asia. The Arab world's performance has also been impressive in terms of gains in life expectancy, infant mortality, child immunization rates, and the provision of basic education. So just some examples of this. In the Arab world, life expectancy has grown by 20 years over the past generation. Life expectancy nearly equals that of the United States, and it's comparable to, it far surpasses those of comparably developed countries in East Asia and South Asia. Infant mortality has dropped dramatically in the region over the past generation. Child immunization rates have risen dramatically to the point that immunization is nearly universal. Educational opportunities have increased dramatically, with primary education nearly universal in most Arab countries. And even the region's performance in terms of income distribution is better than you might think. If you measure income inequality by the Gini coefficients that compare the top quintile of the population to the bottom quintile, income inequality in the Arab world is comparable to that of East Asia and Southeast Asia, and well below inequality in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And I saw that in your chart. Egypt was way below Peru and Brazil and the rest. Now, how has this strong performance on economic inclusion, how do we explain that? To some degree, this is a consequence of express public policy on the part of many Arab states. But to some degree, it's a consequence of serendipitous economic and sociocultural factors in the region. But let's look at the first factor. Many states in the Arab world are the stewards of significant rents: oil rents, gas rents, transit rents, geostrategic rents, and access to such rents has enabled them to carry out a variety of redistributive projects, from providing public goods like immunization and education, to subsidizing basic consumer goods, food, oil, gasoline, to expanding the size of the public sector. And the latter, expansion of the public sector, is especially important because it has delivered employment to a significant portion of the population and provided many with a floor of subsistence. But it's not only the rent-rich countries in the region that have followed this distributive path in the Arab world. Even some of the poorer states have followed this path, and that's thanks to the legacy of Arab socialism. This was an ideology that gripped the region in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It inspired a politics of inclusion. The hold of this ideology has dimmed over time, but the institutional legacy lives on in this creation of large public sectors and inclusive social policies. Now, there are other factors besides these express political policy factors that explain the good performance of this region on matters of equity. These include access to remittances and strong sociocultural networks, some of them religiously based, some of them family-based, that provide important safety nets to the poor. I'm happy to talk about that in the question session if you're interested. But whatever the explanation, the fact is the Arab world has performed better in terms of economic inclusion than most other parts of the developing world. Now, this simple fact constitutes very strong evidence that a region's level of political authoritarianism does not co-vary with the level of economic exclusion. These are not a matched pair. Now, this may sound good in some ways, but it also suggests that the move toward political opening in the region may not necessarily result in gains for economic inclusion. The low-hanging fruit of economic inclusion have already been picked, and to some degree overpicked in the region. So we can't expect that once we move toward a more inclusive political system in Tunisia or in Egypt or in other countries in the region, we're going to see the barriers to equity demolished and economic inclusion ramped up. Now let me now turn to the question of why we might expect greater political inclusion to foster more economic inclusion, at least from an analytic point of view, and why this is less likely to happen in the real world of the contemporary Arab scene. We tend to assume that democracies will outperform authoritarian regimes in terms of economic inclusion because supposedly by endowing people with the power of the vote, the people will be able to force political regimes to be accountable to the popular will. Accountability is what distinguishes democracy, right? So theoretically, in such a system, the ruling elites will be obliged to direct resources to constructive ends that benefit all of society rather than just the interests of a special few. And presumably, too, the poorer strata will be able to use their superior numbers through the power of the vote to impose a more distributive economic agenda on the state. So that's the presumption most of us have. Of course, the reality is quite different. As we all know, democracies are routinely captured by special interests that siphon resources off in economically irrational ways. So the general interests of society are not necessarily served. And as we all know, for the poor to be successful in pushing a policy that is economically distributive, they have to be politically well organized. And that's not a given in most democracies. To the contrary, privileged segments of society are usually much better positioned than the poor to dominate the political helm and its agenda. And we all know this from our experience in the United States, right? Who dominates the electoral scene? Who's running for office? It's millionaires, right? And why can't the poor mobilize around a progressive candidate? Because they're distracted by other agendas, cultural agendas, identity politics. Now, if that's the way it is in the United States, should we expect anything different in the Arab world? Perhaps the most important reason why we should be pessimistic that political opening will spell more equity and inclusion in the Arab world is because the poor in the Arab world are not effectively mobilized around a more distributive agenda. If you look at the parties with a mass popular base in Tunisia, in Egypt, it's the Islamist parties like Ennahda in Tunisia or Al-Hurriya wal-Adala in Egypt. That these are the parties that command a large popular base. But they have not made economic redistribution the centerpiece of their agenda. To the contrary, they have only very vaguely defined economic agendas. So without effective political mobilization, forget about the poor being able to cash in on their votes and obtain quick results in terms of economic inclusion and equity. Now that said, now that our expectations have been reined in a bit, let's consider the major development challenges that face the Middle East and North Africa and think about what are the best routes to advancing the goal of economic inclusion. Given the region's relatively strong starting point in terms of economic inclusion, making progress in this area means focusing less on guaranteeing a subsistence floor to most and more on lifting ever larger numbers of people out of poverty. And the most promising route to lifting ever larger numbers of people out of poverty can be summed up in one word: jobs. The most promising route to reducing poverty and achieving economic inclusion is to sop up the high levels of unemployment and underemployment that plague the region and consign so many to hopelessness. The level of unemployment in the Middle East and North Africa is one of the highest in the world. It officially clocks in at 14%, and at this rate, it's surpassed by only one other developing region in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, which clocks in at 14.9. Unemployment in the Middle East and North Africa is more than double that of East Asia and nearly double that of Latin America. And these figures actually understate the incidence of unemployment borne by specific portions of the population. So young people suffer much higher rates of unemployment than that. It clocks in at about 30%. For college-educated students, it often clocks in at 40 to 45%. There are regional pockets of poverty, certain parts of different countries that have much higher rates of poverty. So, for example, if you're familiar with Mohammed Bouazizi, that young man who set himself on fire and then set off the whole Arab Spring last year, he was from central Tunisia, the town of Sidi Bouzid, which has an unemployment rate of about 35%, so much higher than the national average. And then, of course, there's the question of women, who are significantly underemployed in the region. Only 30% of women, of Arab women, work outside the home. That's a level of employment that's lower than any, for women, that is lower than any other developing part of the world. Now, granted, this is a little bit of a complicated issue. It's not clear how much that lack of employment outside the home is a matter of cultural choice and preference versus opportunity. So it is complicated, but still 30%, that's a very, very low level. So lack of jobs constitutes a significant obstacle to effective economic inclusion. And to tackle the problem of unemployment, the region must focus on generating economic growth. As a leading economist from Egypt said to me, without economic growth, a politics of distribution simply means distribution of poverty. And for this growth to have the most distributive impact possible, it has to be a particular kind of growth. It has to be built around the development of labor-intensive industries that will create jobs. Now, what are the obstacles to developing such industries? And here I'm going to be a bit of an economist, though I'm not an economist, so I'm a little embarrassed talking in front of my colleagues who are experts. I hope I don't get this wrong. But my sense is the major obstacles in the Middle East, among others, are deficiencies in capital investment, both foreign direct investment as well as investment by domestic private sectors, and deficiencies in integration in the international economy, very low trade levels with the rest of the world. Both investment levels and integration into their national economy are extremely low in the Arab world. And the poor performance of the region in these areas is attributed to two factors. Well, it's very important for two factors. First, it denies the Middle East and North Africa important startup capital to get these industrial ventures going. And second, lack of integration with the international economy, lack of integration, inter-trade agreements with other foreign companies, shuts the region out of major sources of technology transfer and major sources of innovation and cost discipline, and all of those are absolutely crucial if you want to be globally competitive and really maintain sustainable industries, export industries. So why has the Middle East and North Africa been so poor at attracting foreign direct investment, local capital, intra-trade agreements? Some of it has to do with structural weaknesses, things to do with infrastructure and education, which I won't get into so much here. But another reason the MENA fails to attract investment and inter-trade agreement is the region's business environment that is extremely unattractive and made so in part by political factors. The political factors that make the business environment unattractive are at least fourfold. You've got political instability, and there's this wonderful thing that a colleague of mine from Jordan said, who said, always remember that capital is a coward. So when you've got an unstable situation, capital is going to flee. So you've got political instability, you have dodgy political institutions, right? Property rights are not necessarily upheld in timely fashion by the judiciary. You have, third, bureaucratic constraints, very difficult to get permits to start a business, that sort of thing. You get your materials out through customs. And fourth, you have corruption. You've got to pay off a lot of officials to get things through the system. Now, the World Bank's Business Enterprise Survey found that more than a quarter of all businesses polled identified licensing and customs as a major constraint on doing business in this region, and 54% identified corruption as a major constraint. So governance issues are clearly a huge obstacle to economic progress in the region. So now we know the major challenge to advancing the cause of economic inclusion. We need job creation. We know the solution to the problem. We need to attract more foreign direct investment, more intra-trade agreements, more domestic capital. Then the question is, so what role will political opening play in all this? Will political inclusion help this process along? And here's where I'm going to conclude. Now, on the optimistic side, political opening might mean some improvement in governance issues, Political liberalization could mean unseating the old political machines that fuel corruption and maintain rent-creating distortions in the economy. And similarly, political opening might mean an empowered fourth estate, empowered media, civil society, and those might maintain a watchdog function and impose more transparency on the government, reduce corruption. So that's all good from the perspective of improving governance. Also on the optimistic side of the ledger, greater freedom and reform might unleash new energy, new optimism, and reverse brain drain, and that might also spur investment and growth in the economy. But on the pessimistic side of the ledger, we have to realize that just as political opening creates growth-enhancing opportunities, it also creates potential hazards. And the biggest hazard lies in the region's susceptibility to demagogues and populists. After years of political exclusion and pent-up demand for economic advance, the newly empowered societies may be ill-prepared for the material restraint necessary to really spur growth. The temptation among inexperienced voters, frankly, even experienced voters like the Americans, is to elect politicians who promise you the moon. And so they may set off spending sprees that would only worsen the region's macroeconomic conditions, not to mention exchange rates. They might increase the possibility of instability, and all that is going to discourage investment and growth and job creation. And that would clearly not advance the objective of economic inclusion in any sustainable way. Also, we shouldn't overestimate how quickly governance problems can be corrected in the region, even with political opening. But I'm running out of time, so let me just say, I'll conclude on a somewhat less pessimistic note. There are some reasons to be hopeful. And to my mind, one of the reasons to be most hopeful about economic progress in the Arab world is that there are several models of success that may show the way and inspire the Arab world to progress. There are a number of countries that, for reasons of cultural proximity, constitute very important reference for the Arab world, and that have successfully embraced political opening and globalization and integration into the international economy with significant success. And here I'm referring to the cases of Turkey and Indonesia and Malaysia. Each one of these is a Muslim-majority country. Each has Islamist parties that have been central to political life. Each has pursued a strategy of export-oriented manufacturing as a crucial component of its growth plan. And these countries constitute a very important model for the Arab world as a possible way forward. And the importance of the demonstration effect should not be underestimated. It is one of the most important factors shaping a country's likelihood to embrace a new path. So there are reasons for hope. And perhaps if the Arab world learns from those examples, we may see real achievement in the realm of equity and inclusion. Thank you.